In the 1930s, Berlin was the largest city on the continent. Wealthy, fashionable and cosmopolitan, the capital of Germany was also the epicenter of Hitler's Third Reich. Berlin stood on the brink of disaster. During the latter stages of World War II, the city was devastated by Allied bombardment and, on Hitler's defeat, fell to the Soviet army. Hot on their heels came the Americans and the British.
The capital of Germany, shattered symbol of Prussian military arrogance, is in full Allied occupation. Outside the luxury Adlon Hotel, great posters portraying the Big Three ram home the uncompromising facts of utter German defeats. Never in history has there been ruin on such a scale as this.
There then began a long controversy amongst the Allies over who had the right to rule there. The Potsdam Conference of 1945 divided Germany and therefore Berlin into 4 occupation zones, giving a segment to each of the Allies. As a result of this, in 1948, East and West Berlin were given separate governments, the Soviet Communists in the East and the Democratic Allies in the West. Over the next decade, more than 3 million East Germans fled to the West as the Cold War built to a peak between the USA and the USSR. In 1961, the two sides attempted to resolve the border issues. But amidst great nuclear tension, no solution was found. The flood of refugees stepped up and the Soviets panicked. On August the 13th, 1961, the Soviets closed the border with barbed wire. The construction of the wall had begun. In 1985, after almost a quarter of a century of division, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev began the process of democratic reform, and the Cold War began to thaw. On November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was finally opened, and Germans from both sides flocked to it, attacking the wall with anything they could lay their hands on, while the soldiers looked on impassively. Finally, the Germans were free to travel between East and West without restriction. The celebrations lasted for days. Eight months later, on what had been the no man's land between East and West, the largest rock concert ever staged on German soil marked the end of the Berlin Wall.
Towards the end of the 80s, when Roger had separated from Pink Floyd, the idea of doing The Wall as a big show came up again, and we investigated the idea of doing it, in the Sahara Desert or in extraordinary places, Monument Valley in America, somewhere where we could make a big statement.
And then in '89, in November '89, when it all started to disintegrate, it became completely obvious that maybe Berlin was going to be a place where it would be possible.
The wall in Berlin, it was just Roger seeing the opportunity, the obvious opportunity, to reproduce his piece in a place which would have some further meaning, perhaps.
In the hurry and scurry of it all coming together, we didn't really think whether we were right or whether we were appropriate, in a sense. We could see that there was this very direct, simple analogy between the wall and the wall, and that one dealt with the personal alienation and one dealt with the political alienation. And no one went any further than that, if you like, into the appropriateness of the creativity.
If you tear down your personal wall and become more vulnerable again, you give more love. So symbolically, I suppose that did fit in with Berlin, which was then able to integrate. Families that were split apart were able to rejoin and go and visit one another.
You needed something to mark that moment, and this was a very, very convenient thing to do.
I guess the symbolic connotations were more important than the rock and roll show.
We looked at a number of different sites in Berlin, but Potsdamer Platz, which had been the no man's land between West and East Berlin, surrounded by two walls. It had a wall on the west side and a wall on the east side, and it was this no man's land in between. And it had been the place where Kennedy had made his speech and so forth, and a number of people had been killed.
Everyone knows that this Potsdamer Platz has been a place for death. People try to come over the wall, and they died.
It then took on a whole kind of new vibe, because nobody had been on that ground since 1945. So it was pretty special.
I had this fear that Potsdamer Platz was actually mined, because nobody could tell us whether it was mined or not, the way these things get lost. So I had the whole of the area. I asked the authorities if they could minesweep it, which they did.
So after the first few weeks of working on the site, there were, piles of earth everywhere from all the excavations.
Many grenades and things were found, but most extraordinarily, a former SS bunker was found where Hitler had died at the end of the war.
It was pretty amazing historically.
As we were building up our show over a number of weeks, the wall was gradually disappearing. We actually asked them if they would leave the bit of wall in the backstage area, because it meant that we didn't have to put a security fence up.
Is there anybody out there?
They stopped charging people when we got to 250 or 260,000, and there were like another 100,000 people came in, so it was a huge, huge crowd.
I can remember the feeling of this crowd arriving. I tried not to look at it. And that we got up to having got the ticketed audience in, and then there was this debate about what you do. So the decision was taken just to sort of take the fences away so that nobody got crushed, and that's all you could do in that situation.
The great thing about these big shows is it's rather like opera. You've got the singers, you've got the scenery, you've got the orchestra, and you've got the costumes, and all of these various elements come together and they create a whole, which I think is bigger than just the music.
It was very, very difficult to make sure all of that came off all at once. And we were doing it live on television to 50 countries, and then by the end of the week to another 50 countries. An enormous broadcast.
My job really is to imagine images that go with Roger's lyrics and ideas. I have to create a reality out of these floating ideas. He may have a very strong idea in his mind of what these characters look like, but he can't or didn't project them. That was my job, was to interpret his mind, or interpret his mind plus my mind, and create an image which stays. As far as Berlin's concerned, I didn't have so much input, because most of my work was already done. They showed the films that I had already completed. They rebuilt, I think, the inflatables that I designed for the early shows, but they were much bigger. We redesigned, redid the pig, a much more grotesque and frightening pig.
We started with the inflatables. Inflatable structures are very useful in performance because they could appear from nowhere and then disappear. It could be highly painted, very light to move around, and pack up in a small suitcase and take them on to the next concert. The teacher was 30 or 35 metres, 120 feet high. So this is a model of the teacher And this was a big inflatable head inflated through the neck with spotlights in the eyes, and the hands were big inflatables, big enough to completely encompass a Mercedes car. And these arms were down on the stage, grasping where Cyndi Lauper was running through singing "We Don't Want No Education." And it was operated like a string puppet by the tower crane, so that it was possible to move the arms and so forth.
Roger always said, and this is something I always appreciated, that when you hire an artist to do something, the artist should be left to realise his ideas without interference from anybody else. So that's a very kind of broad-minded view of it all.
Many of the fans who, inevitably were people who were Pink Floyd Wall fans would understand the Wall to be the pig and the teacher and all of those symbolic characters that are within the show and are characterised by Jerry Scarf's drawings. So you had this kind of strange thing where it had to be new but recognisably old at the same time. Weird brief. At that point in time, pretty much all the cameras of the world had been focused on a line of concrete in the middle of Berlin for quite a while, and the visual material on the western side of that wall that had been graffitied constantly for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years at least, had some very, very immediate graphic material of its own, a language of its own, which we basically used as a starting point for creating symbols. So what we started doing was actually sacrilegiously mashing up Jerry Scarf's drawings and photocopying them and screwing them up into little balls and then unfolding them and rephotocopying them and turning them into pieces of graffiti so that they would match the visual style of everything else.
There is a lot of war imagery in it, and fascist imagery in it, and racist imagery in it. But Berlin was made in a very, very strange post-Second World War context. It was the child, it was a sort of strange remnant of the Second World War.
It's ironic that that the Germans were being shown, a piece of film which talked about the war.
I don't think any of the imagery that was used in the first show or the second show was anti-German at all.
It was never before that directly about Nazism or Germany, apart from it being set in the war and Roger or Pink having lost his father in the war.
I think the narrative of Roger's show was an anti-totalitarian narrative.
When it was translated to Germany, it did have a different meaning. My oppressive symbolism of the marching hammers are very Nazi-like.
I hope that people interpreted those images as these type of images. It's this type of setting up of differences between peoples in war that gives birth to strange situations, such as people were asked to live within Berlin itself. It wasn't so much about the falling of the wall, in a sense, as what created it.
Then when it goes to bring the boys back home, which is so clear and evident what it's about. And the graphics I thought that Mark and Jonathan produced at that point were quite compelling and interesting as well. In Germany, to have pictures of German officers as well as other people on this big wall and then all the crosses and things. And with this, Russian marching band playing these brass instruments rather badly. I thought that was quite edgy and cool.
Roger wanted to have some mass band in the piece. So immediately after I'd been given the role of casting and recruiting all the artists, I'd flown to Berlin the next day and I said to Reinhard Heinemann, where do I get a marching band from? And he said, we get the Soviet Army's marching band. And we got in his little Trabant, these little East German cars, smaller than Minis, with a two-stroke engine in. And we potted off. We'd already been to see the orchestra and the choir that day. And we potted off to their camp and booked them. Simple as a $50,000 backhander.
The day that we went to rehearse them was quite fascinating because we were driven into East Germany and we were driven for hours and hours, it seemed, and eventually we came to this village and we were asking people, where is this huge, there's a Russian army camp somewhere near here, no one would tell us. They absolutely wouldn't tell us, and then we're saying, no such thing exists, and eventually we found the gate was about 100 yards away, you know, and then we're like 20,000 Russian troops in this huge camp, and they wouldn't let us in.
I think we were the first Westerners ever to go into the Russian military headquarters in East Germany since day one. That was pretty spooky.
Here was this thing in the middle of Germany, and none of the guards spoke a word of German.
There were rather scruffily dressed Russian soldiers that I sort of looked at and I thought, you know, well, they're the frontline Russian troops, you know. My God, thank goodness, you know, the wall's coming down. And thank goodness, you know, they're not going to be there for much longer.
They were a bit cautious because they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. They knew something was happening. They knew they were going home. They knew they weren't staying there, but they weren't quite sure, you know, whether to be, how open to be.
You know, it was November the year before that tanks had rolled into Berlin and things. And yet we were able to get the marching band of the Soviet Union on stage in an event that was marking the moment in time when the wall had fallen. It showed, I think, just how confused the times were.
I've seen Russian or Soviet Union soldiers, they are weeping. They're standing beside the former wall, and they are weeping, and I asked them what happened to you, why you're weeping. And they told me that they felt that something in the world has changed, and the Iron Curtain has going down.
The musicians were pretty slapdash. You know, this was not a great band. They were pretty incompetent, really.
The mock fascist aspects of the wall, you know, was Roger's imagination in the original wall, and we wondered how that would work in the concert, but it was very strong there.
It sat very well with me. I've never had a problem about singing any of those lyrics in Germany or anywhere else. The lyrics are kind of obnoxious to some of the songs, but clearly everybody understands that it's satire, and so I get forgiven for, you know, all this stuff about coons and Jews things. People seem to accept that it's okay because they know I'm not racist and that, you know, I don't mean it, that I'm playing a part, and that it's okay as part of the play. You can't write rock and roll without offending somebody.
It was quite difficult at the beginning to cast it because it was Roger's piece. It's Roger's piece, he wrote it.
Eric was going to do it, and so was Joe Cocker originally, but that was when we had the date a month earlier, and when we moved the date, Joe was doing a concert somewhere else. And Eric got cold feet.
I said, I think Joni Mitchell would be excellent for Goodbye Blue Sky. I can hear her singing it. Goodbye, blue sky. And he said, well, that would be fantastic if you could get her. Clearly, Joni was well respected by Roger.
It was very hard to get people to actually commit. Some of them didn't. Some of them just, like Joni, for instance, just went, no, I'll do it, boom. Where do I sign? But a lot of, some other people were like, well, I'm not sure, you know, who else is doing it, you know, the thing. I wanted to make sure it was kosher.
I first asked Rod Stewart to do the songs that Bryan Adams then did, but I think that Bryan did a better job than Rod would have done, in fact, in the end. because he has such a sort of dynamite way of performing. I think it was a suggestion of Roger's, actually, was that we went for Van Morrison to do Comfortably Numb. Whilst that was very difficult to persuade Van to come into it all, because he's quite a shy person, I think that piece worked very well as well.
Rehearsing Van Morrison in England, which is, just sort of amazing, because he's so cut off and difficult, and such a great singer and songwriter.
Good morning, world, Your Honor.
They recreated the trial in Berlin with actors, and it worked. Yes, it worked. Of course, I was used to the animation. Although I say it wasn't my favourite piece of animation, I still liked it.
Evidence before the court is incontrovertible. There's no need for the jury to return.
My suggestion was to try and contact Sean Connery to be the judge. And Roger was going, no, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. And I went through a whole list of other names, and eventually came to Albert Finney, and he said, yes, it's Albert Finney, it's Albert Finney. And sometimes I see him down the pub, he said. So I phoned up Albert Finney's agent at that point, and Albert agreed to do it as well. And thereafter it became Tim Curry, and we brought Marianne Faithfull in.
And Marianne's a very old friend of mine who I adore.
Thomas Dolby, who was a fantastically cooperative person and agreed to be the teacher and be hung from the top of the wall and do all his spailing around and things. He was just very cooperative, lovely person to do with. Well, there was a completely separate staging that we did in post-production for Uta Lemper at the top of the tower, where the filming of that on the night had just been wrong. The camera work had just been too shaky for us to use. So we brought her over to Brixton Academy and pretended that the sky was black and shot her against black. I think for the artists, really, that it was the idea that this was a globally broadcast event meant that they knew that people would see and appreciate it if they got it right, which most of them did.
I was so involved in trying to do my job, and and we had one or two glitches early on in the show, so I was pretty tense through most of it.
There were two wonderful moments when it all went wrong.
I thought something was up, but I thought hopefully it was just the camera had gone down. Little did I realise that the whole of the stage power went down.
I've got a photograph at home in my studio of me on my knees like that, in the middle of the stage. I mean, I couldn't believe it happened twice, like in the first quarter of an hour.
One of the circuit breakers went out, and the musicians on the stage had no power, and the monitor mixer had no power. There was nothing I could do other than hope and wait.
Your hair started standing up on the back of your neck because there was a lot of people there not getting what they were there for.
We lost the sound in Mother, and I found myself tap dancing in front of 300,000 people, because there was nothing else to do. There was nothing going on. It took several minutes to discover exactly what it was and what was going on, and then in the meantime we were screwed. We couldn't do anything. It was frightening. It was really, truly frightening.
It came back on again, and then it went off again, and then it came back on. The first time it came back on, we thought, fantastic, good, we're on track. And then it went off again, and that was a very deflating moment because we thought, oh no, this is going to be fraught with problems here. But it came back on again and it stayed on.
That was pretty hair-raising. Sinead O'Connor going, I can't hear anything, what did I hear? I said, no, we've lost all the power on the stage. What'll I do, what'll I do? I said, well, just smile, follow me. And then we heard odd bits, and I said, if you hear anything, mime, pretend you're singing, which she famously afterwards accused me of having tried to force her to mime on stage and stuff. So I just don't think she quite understood it. She was rather young, you know, not nearly as professional as the other people who were doing the show.
What I'd done in trying to make this as safe as possible for a live broadcast is said that we have to film the day before, that we have to stage a full dress rehearsal with a limited audience in front and run it all and film it all.
It went out live, but when we lost the power, what went out was the safety from the dress rehearsal. Switch over to that, you know, for a few, and it was only a few minutes. Most of it was the live show. It was Thin Ice and Mother. Those were the only two things that went out from the Friday. Everything else went out live.
Immediately after the finale, I had to put out the message on the headphones to all the floor managers of hold all cast, hold all performers, and the same to all the technical crew.
We repaired the stuff after everybody had gone home. We stayed till 2 or 3 o'clock the next morning, reran Uta Lemper's bit, which was one of the bits we lost. She stayed, bless her, and everybody stayed, except Sinead. Sinead was a bit too grand to stay, so we had to use her performance from the dress rehearsal from the Friday to go out for, which is what you see on the DVD. That's her at the dress rehearsal, because she refused to come back and do it for reasons that only she can possibly understand.
We clearly had to shoot all that from the front in, because going the other way was a receding audience and a load of bricks. But we corrected a lot that night.
The wall that we did in Berlin was 20 metres high, 60 feet, and about 300 metres long, because we wanted it to be a huge symbol, because there was going to be such a huge audience. The defining moment for me, curiously enough, was when the wall came down. We all stood on the scaffolding behind the wall, and we only did this once. We were never able to rehearse it. And as soon as the moment came, the cue went up, and what they had been told is you start pushing the wall down from the top row of bricks downwards. And there was this huge kerfuffle as everybody's pushing the rows of bricks off, and absolutely all the wall came down in about 30 seconds. It was the most impressive sight. This was an extraordinary moment, and that's my biggest memory of it.
Everything about it was a spectacle.
It was certainly the biggest and most extravagant show I've ever worked on, and I don't think there'll ever be another one like it.
I love the idea that this little idea that started on the back of an envelope suddenly becomes sort of worldwide.
It was a major engineering feat to bring this show off, apart from an artistic feat.
It's like doing a school play raised to the power 1 million.
It's all a bit of a blur, really. There was so much work involved, and having seen it, I think, you know, it's quite impressive that it happened, really.
I think something just like a breeze goes over Germany, and a good breeze from the east and from the west, and the breeze comes together on the Potsdamer Platz at this moment.
I think it marked a moment in time. It wasn't a celebration in a sort of happy champagne type of sense. It wasn't that. It was a more weighty type of experience.
It was more than a concert. It was an event. It was a community of love, peace, and future.
The time was right to have a spectacular event, and this, I think, fitted the bill, you know, very well.
It's not something I'd ever try and do again, I don't think.